they are front loading, I believe, 7 years worth of interest on that $300 billion of seized Russian assets. So the idea is to get the money to Ukraine, but also to set in place a schedule so that no matter what happens next year, no matter which European and United States leaders are sitting in those chairs at the next G7 summit, that there would still be money coming in for Ukraine.
Kellyanne Shaw is the former lead negotiator for the United States at the G7 and G20 under President Trump. Kellyanne, hello to you.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on.
Now, great to talk to you because you've been there in the room. You've done the negotiation. And you heard Prime Minister Sunak saying that this was a game-changing package. Now, we hear these big statements whenever these leaders get together. What do you make? Does it pass muster? Is it really game-changing?
Yeah, well, you have a right to be skeptical when it comes to announcements from forums like the G7 and G20, who for years had been floundering in terms of having really a business case for them. But I have to say, I do think the G7 is having a renaissance. It's really having a moment in terms of its role in navigating all these geopolitical conflicts happening. And it's a clear, strong sign of support to have this huge announcement of $50 billion for the Ukrainians at this time. So I do think it's a big announcement.
Why do you think that the G7 is having a renaissance? And what makes you think that this package will make a major difference?
Well, I do think for years there was skepticism as to what was coming out of the G7. It was really just leaders getting together, having a chance to discuss issues. They would issue these statements, these communiques. They'd have sort of fluff announcements, but there wasn't a lot of concrete action that they could point to. But after COVID, with the hot war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, with the conflict in the Middle East, with challenges around China, the G7 has actually stepped up to be one of the few forums where Western leaders can get together and make progress on some of these issues. And I think the sanctions packages that we're seeing come out of the United States and the European Union on Russia, the coordinated approach to a lot of actions on China, and now this announcement for Ukraine do actually show a united front. And they are some real concrete deliverables that the G7 is finally producing.
How would you compare and contrast what the G7 has produced with what NATO has done when it comes to supporting Ukraine? Because a number of NATO countries, including the US, have been accused of being a bit too nervous at Russia's potential reaction, having delayed the supply of weapons to Ukraine or tied their hands and limited what they can do with them, including striking across the border in Russia.
Yeah, well, these forums and the aid that was announced today has a very different purpose than the type of support that NATO is providing. So the money, the $50 billion, is aimed at reconstruction, it's aimed at development, it's aimed at economic support for Ukraine. Whereas in the NATO context, that's where you're dealing with some of the military support issues. And I do think a number of countries are walking a fine line in terms of how to handle this situation. In the United States, President Biden is trying to be as forward-leaning, I think, as possible without sort of getting the United States into an armed conflict. And he's actually taken quite a bit of flack politically among some circles for the level of support that the U.S. has provided. But I do think there's a strong case for engagement from all NATO allies in terms of showing support.
How quickly do you think this 50 billion, which is a loan, it's important to say,
Yeah.
will be delivered to the Ukrainians?
Well, as I understand, and the details have not been released yet, I understand they're going to be worked out in the next couple of weeks and eventually made public. But they are front loading, I believe, 7 years worth of interest on that $300 billion of seized Russian assets. So the idea is to get the money to Ukraine, but also to set in place a schedule so that no matter what happens next year, no matter which European and United States leaders are sitting in those chairs at the next G7 summit, that there would still be money coming in for Ukraine.
One of the reasons why there's a particular sense of urgency at this G7 is that the clock is ticking, isn't it, Kellyanne? And
Yeah.
there's a prospect of President Trump 2.0, the return of Donald Trump, who takes a dim view of multilateralism and what the likes of NATO and the G7 might deliver. How complicated might the return of Donald Trump, or how difficult might things be if he comes back?
Well, as his lead negotiator at the G7, I'm not sure I would totally character or agree with that
Really?
characterization of his views at the G7.
I remember him
No,
shoving his way through a group of world leaders in order to get to the front for a photo opportunity. Do you remember that one?
You know, what I would say is I do think for a long time the G7 didn't necessarily have a defined role of what it was trying to accomplish. But it's not just the United States who may have a different leader come January sitting in the chair for the G7. There are a number of other countries sitting around the table who may also have different leaders. And I think the G7 is in part driven by personality. I do think that makes some difference, the specific individuals who are there, but I also think the biggest driving factor is what's its purpose. And right now, there are a number of hot and important conflicts that need to be resolved. And the G7, with its flexibility and the fact that there isn't this institutionalized bureaucracy and it's more fluid and it allows the host country every year to set the agenda, I think has actually proven incredibly successful at getting important leaders organized around the table.
Do you think President Trump would have supported this package, from what you know of him?
I don't want to opine on hypotheticals, but what I will say is I do think that it is important that we are continuing to support Ukraine, and I think this is a very smart way to do it.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Kelly Ann Shaw, former lead negotiator at the US during the time of President Trump, and that was at the G7 and G20. Thank you.
Both leaders will now sign an historic new bilateral security agreement between the United States and Ukraine.
Today is a truly historic day, and we have signed the strongest agreement within Ukraine and the US since our independence.
Security agreement signed tonight and the other promises of support.
And this is something that will not only provide security, but also new, good jobs for Ukrainians and Americans.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a question for President Zelensky shortly on the announcement.
The issue of NATO is covered through the text of the agreement. It states that America supports Ukraine's future membership in NATO and recognizes that our security agreement is a bridge to Ukraine's membership in NATO.
On developing Ukraine's air defense system based on the most advanced Western countries.
I had phone conversation with the leader of China by phone. He said that he will not sell any weapon to Russia.